Welcome to Stalingrad, the city that swallowed an army whole. Once it was the beating heart of Soviet industry, a proud city on the Volga, where smoke meant progress and the future seemed unstoppable. But by the autumn of 1942, that smoke had turned to fire. The sky itself had become an inferno. Every building burned until there was no skyline left, only jagged silhouettes against a crimson dawn. The Germans called it conquest. The Soviets called it survival. But history would remember it as a slaughterhouse built from brick and bone. The first air raids came without warning, waves of German bombers droning above like a plague of steel. In a single night, 40,000 civilians were erased, their screams swallowed by the roar of collapsing walls. Yet even as the flames devoured the city, men and women crawled out from the ruins with rifles in their hands and fury in their eyes. The Volga River glowed red with reflected fire, and across its surface drifted the cries of the wounded, mixing with the crackle of burning oil. Stalingrad was dying, but it refused to fall. When the German Sixth Army marched in, they expected another swift victory, the same lightning conquest that had carried them across Europe. They had tanks, aircraft, and the confidence of empire. But this was no ordinary battlefield. It was a maze of shattered streets where the dead never stayed still. The Soviets had melted into the ruins, invisible, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every window concealed a sniper, every sewer a passageway, every crater a trap. Blitzkrieg, the fast war, was over. What followed was something slower, colder, and far more terrible. By winter, the snow had buried the city in silence. The Volga froze solid, its surface cracked and black beneath the weight of war. Tanks stood still, their engines frozen, while soldiers huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Hunger gnawed at them from within. Frostbite crept over their fingers like a slow poison. The city smelled of smoke and rot, of burnt oil and frozen blood. Even the crows that circled overhead looked thin and desperate, waiting for the next explosion to reveal their feast. Inside the Red October factory, Soviet defenders fought for every step of ground. Their hands were raw from the cold, their uniforms stiff with ice, but their eyes still burned with something fierce and unyielding. They passed rifles from the dead to the living, shared crumbs of bread between 10 men and melted snow to drink. At night, the walls shook with shellfire dust falling like snow over their heads, yet not one of them spoke of surrender. Behind them lay the Volga, and behind the Volga, nothing. So they stayed. They fought. They endured. Across the lines, the Germans were breaking. What began as an invasion turned into a slow, choking entombment. Every street they captured became another grave. They wrote home about the cold, about the hunger, about the endless faces of the enemy that seemed to rise from nowhere. And still they advanced, until one morning they realized they could go no farther. The trap had already closed. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, had sealed them inside the ruins they had once conquered. 300,000 men cut off from the world, surrounded by a silence that grew heavier each day. For weeks they waited for rescue, but the sky remained empty. Food ran out. The last horses were eaten. Men tore buttons from coats to boil them for salt, lit fires with pages torn from Bibles, whispered prayers into the wind. The mighty Sixth Army, once the spearhead of Hitler's campaign, had become a ghostly remnant of itself, starving, frostbitten, delirious. And in that delirium they saw it clearly. The city was alive. It watched them. It waited. It wanted them all. Stalingrad was not merely a battlefield, it was a devouring force. Every brick, every shard of glass, every echo of footsteps seemed to conspire against them. The Soviets fought with patience born from despair, the Germans with discipline born from fear, and between them the snow kept falling, covering everything in a quiet that was almost holy. Historians would one day count the dead 2 million souls, but numbers could never capture the sound of that silence. It was the sound of war eating itself alive. Before we begin, take a breath. Look around the warmth of your room, the hum of your screen, the pulse beneath your wrist. Now imagine all of it fading, until there is only the cold, the dark, and the endless scream of wind across frozen ruins. That was Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. Tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are now? Because for the next hour, you and I will walk through that city together. Through the smoke, the hunger, the snow, and into the heart of the trap that swallowed an army. Summer 1942. The eastern horizon shimmered with heat, but beneath that light, an empire was overreaching itself. Hitler's armies had conquered everything from the Channel to the Don. From the Arctic tundra to the deserts of North Africa, the map of Europe bore his mark. Yet victory had become a hunger that devoured reason. The Führer's gaze turned eastward again to the Volga, to the oil-rich Caucasus, to a city whose very name mocked him. Stalingrad. He saw not a place but an obsession, the chance to strike at Stalin himself, to seize his city, erase his name, and crush the Soviet will in one blow. What began as a military objective was now a contest of egos written in blood. The operation was codenamed Fall Blau Case Blue, a grand offensive designed to seize the southern Soviet Union. The plan was audacious: split the German army group south, send one thrust toward the oil of Baku, and another along the Volga toward Stalingrad. The generals warned that the front was too wide, the supply lines too fragile, but Hitler silenced them. He wanted the Volga. He wanted the river that fed the heart of Russia. Once we control Stalingrad, he declared, the Soviets will collapse. What he did not foresee was that this river would drown his army instead. By August, the German 6th Army, 330,000 men strong, rolled east under the banner of destiny. Their columns stretched for miles, kicking up dust that glowed gold under the late summer sun. Civilians fled ahead of them, leaving behind scorched earth and empty villages. From the air, the Luftwaffe struck bridges, trains, and convoys, turning retreat into massacre. Soviet morale was near collapse. Entire divisions shattered. It seemed nothing could stop the German advance. And yet, in the shadow of their triumph, the seeds of disaster were already sown. The further they moved east, the thinner their lifelines stretched. Supply convoys crawled over broken roads. Fuel depots ran dry, engines overheated. Soldiers marched on half rations, sleeping in ditches beside burned-out tanks. The promised support from the northern and southern fronts lagged behind, and coordination crumbled under the weight of overconfidence. It was a march of exhaustion, not glory, a race against geography itself. Behind the lines, Hitler grew impatient. Stalingrad must fall quickly, he demanded. But the city was still far ahead, shimmering like a mirage on the horizon, a mirage that would soon turn into a storm. On August 23, 1942, the sky above Stalingrad darkened. The first wave of German bombers arrived, hundreds of Heinkels and Junkers sweeping in from the west. The raids lasted for hours. Streets vanished under walls of flame. Entire districts dissolved in smoke and dust. The Volga reflected fire instead of sunlight, and people caught on the riverbanks burned where they stood. More than 40,000 civilians died that day, burned, crushed, or buried alive. The Luftwaffe had promised to soften the city for the coming invasion. Instead, it transformed Stalingrad into a furnace of rubble, and that rubble became the Soviet army's strongest ally. The first German troops entered a nightmare. What they expected to be open boulevards were now twisted corridors of concrete and steel. Tanks stalled among debris, their treads clogged with shattered bricks. Snipers waited in the smoke. The Soviets had vanished underground into basements, sewers, tunnels. What had been a city was now a labyrinth. For every street the Germans captured, another flank appeared. The Wehrmacht was built for speed, for mechanized warfare. But in Stalingrad, speed meant nothing. This was a war fought at 10 meters, sometimes 3, sometimes 1. In September, the Red Army began to feed more troops across the Volga under the cover of darkness. The crossings were hellish barges hit by artillery ice and blood floating together on the river. Those who reached the city found no front lines, only chaos. They fought in factories, in cellars, in stairwells, often against enemies they could not see. "We fight for every step," wrote a Soviet sergeant. "The city is our fortress, and every ruin is sacred." Stalin's order, 227. Not one step back echoed through the ranks. Retreat was impossible. Victory unthinkable. Only survival remained. The Germans gave the battle a name, Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. Soldiers crawled through pipes, tunnels, and alleys. They killed each other in the dark with bayonets, shovels, even bare hands. Civilians trapped between the lines scavenged for food among corpses. Smoke hung so thick that day looked like twilight. And through it all, the Volga kept flowing, carrying the wounded, the dead, and the desperate. The city became a wound that would not close. But as brutal as the fighting inside Stalingrad was, the greater danger came from beyond it. While Hitler fixated on capturing the city street by street, his generals pleaded for him to secure the flanks. Those flanks were thinly held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions, brave men, but poorly equipped, poorly trained, and unprepared for the coming storm. Stalin and his generals saw it clearly. "We will not take the city," said Zhukov. "We will take the army that took it." The plan was simple, in design terrifying in scale. Two great Soviet fronts, the Don Front under Rokossovsky and the Stalingrad Front under Yeremenko, would converge in a pincer movement. The northern arm would strike south from Serafimovich. The southern arm would drive north from Kotelnikovo. Their jaws would meet west of the city, trapping the Sixth Army inside. It would be called Operation Uranus. But timing was everything. They waited for the frost, for the ground to harden under the coming winter. The soldiers of the Red Army dug in hiding tanks under branches, painting them white against the snow. The hunters were patient. November 19th, 1942. Dawn broke gray and silent. Then thunder. More than 3,000 Soviet guns roared in unison, shaking the frozen earth. The air filled with fire and steel. Snow turned black. Within hours, the German front lines buckled. Entire Romanian divisions vanished under the onslaught. Tanks rolled through the smoke like phantoms. By the third day, the trap had closed. Stalingrad, the city of fire, became a prison of ice. Inside it, 300,000 men waited for orders that would never come. Hitler refused to believe it. "They can hold," he said. "The Luftwaffe will supply them." But the air bridge failed before it even began. Fuel froze. Planes crashed. Each day, fewer supplies reached the city. The proud Sixth Army that had once marched across Europe now waited for salvation that never arrived. And somewhere above the Volga, amid the drifting snow, the balance of the war quietly shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. That was the beginning of the end, the stage now set for a tragedy unlike any other. The ruins were ready, the winter had come, and history itself held its breath. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was destiny waiting to be written in the cold. In the early summer of 1942, The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, over 2,000 kilometers of frozen ambition. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was broken. The winter of 1941 had been brutal, but in his eyes, Moscow's survival was a fluke, not a sign of endurance. Germany had lost 500,000 men and thousands of tanks in the snow, yet the dream of conquest still burned. He told his generals, "The Red Army is like a body with its backbone broken. One more blow and it will collapse. That blow would have a name. Operation Blau. Fall Blau, the blue case." It was not just a military operation. It was the blueprint for domination of the East. Its objectives were vast: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, cut the Volga River, and destroy the Soviet industrial heartland. Fuel was everything. Without it, the German war machine would grind to a halt. Hitler knew his panzers ran not on glory, but on oil, and the Caucasus held the richest reserves in Europe. The Volga was the artery of Soviet logistics, carrying oil north, grain west, and hope east. To cut it was to stop the Soviet heart from beating. On paper, it was genius, daring, sweeping, decisive. But on the ground, it was chaos waiting to happen. The plan split Army Group South into two halves. Army Group A, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm List, tasked with driving into the Caucasus, and Army Group B under General Maximilian von Weichs, heading toward Stalingrad. At their core stood the pride of the Wehrmacht, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus, supported by the 4th Panzer Army. Together they would strike eastward, crush Soviet resistance, and meet on the Volga by autumn. The problem was there was no autumn victory waiting, only an unending plain of distance, heat, and exhaustion. The Germans advanced with dazzling speed, 40 kilometers a day. By July, Voronezh had fallen. Soviet defenses shattered, their lines buckled under relentless armored assaults. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, dropping hundreds of tons of bombs each day. Soviet factories were dismantled and moved east of the Urals. Refugees clogged the roads, heading away from the front. It looked like a repeat of 1941, another year of unstoppable blitzkrieg. Yet behind that illusion of momentum lay a simple truth: Germany did not have the fuel or manpower to sustain such speed forever. For every tank that moved forward, another stood idle waiting for gasoline. For every convoy that reached the front, two were lost in the mud or ambushed along the steppe roads. Temperatures climbed above 40 degrees Celsius. Engines overheated. Soldiers collapsed from heat stroke. The Wehrmacht had become a serpent, stretched too long, strong at its head, but hollow along its spine. Supply lines now stretched over 1,200 kilometers from Poland to the Volga. Ammunition, food, even water had to cross that distance under constant Soviet raids. The maps in Hitler's headquarters showed sweeping arrows and clean advances. But on the ground, men marched through dust and starvation. The Soviet High Command Stavka understood this weakness better than anyone. Stalin's generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky studied the German patterns and saw the overextension. The Red Army could not yet stop the advance, but it could slow it, bleed it, and wait for winter. They adopted a grim strategy: trade space for time, men for attrition. Entire towns were ordered to burn before evacuation. Crops destroyed. Bridges demolished. What the Germans captured was often useless ruin. Each day of pursuit cost them another step toward exhaustion. By late July, German radio intercepts began reporting confusion orders, overlapping units marching in circles, fuel depots misdirected. The split of Army Group South into A and B had created a logistical nightmare. Hitler, ignoring his generals, kept altering objectives. One day the priority was Baku's oil. The next it was Stalingrad's name. He wanted both the fuel and the glory. But by trying to seize two prizes at once, he doomed both. Then came the turning point within the plan itself. On July 23, 1942, Hitler issued Directive Number 45, officially diverting resources towards Stalingrad. From that moment, the Volga city became more than a waypoint. It became the obsession. The OKH staff protested. They knew what this meant. The Sixth Army would have to fight in a massive urban battle without sufficient supplies or flanking protection. But Hitler refused to listen. "The Russians are finished," he said. "They cannot resist forever." His confidence was absolute and deadly. As August began, the German Sixth Army reached the Don River just west of Stalingrad. They were close enough to smell the smoke from its factories. The Luftwaffe launched thousands of sorties, pounding the city day and night. Soviet anti-aircraft gunners fought until their barrels glowed red. By August 23rd, over 1,000 tons of bombs had fallen, and Stalingrad was burning from horizon to horizon. General von Richthofen, commanding Luftflotte 4, radioed back, "The city is destroyed." But in destroying it, he had given the defenders their greatest weapon cover. German troops crossed the Don and advanced toward the Volga. But the further they moved, the slower they became. Soviet resistance hardened around every street and factory. Snipers appeared like ghosts. The first real urban clashes began in early September. Each day cost hundreds of lives for a few hundred meters. Paulus reported to headquarters, "We can take the city, but we will bleed to death in it." Hitler dismissed the warning. He saw only the name and the prestige it promised. "Stalingrad must be taken," he repeated. "It is the key to the south." In truth, it was the lock to his own downfall. By October, Operation Blau had fractured completely. Army Group A bogged down in the Caucasus Mountains, failed to seize the oil fields. Army Group B, trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, had become immobile. What began as the grandest German operation of the war had devolved into two isolated fronts starving for fuel and coordination. The Luftwaffe was overworked, the infantry exhausted, and the Soviets were regrouping. Every kilometer gained now felt like an open wound. The reality was undeniable. Operation Blau had overextended the Wehrmacht beyond recovery. Its logistics collapsed, its strategy dissolved, and its objective once the Volga became a tomb. Behind German lines, the Soviets were already massing for their counterstrike, gathering tanks and artillery in the snow. The hunters were about to become prey. Stalingrad, the city Hitler thought he could erase, was about to erase him from victory. These were the facts behind the myth, the numbers written before the blood. Operation Blau was supposed to bring Germany its empire of oil, its final triumph. Instead, it delivered the seeds of defeat, carried eastward by the very wind that once smelled of gasoline and conquest. By November, the plans in Berlin had turned to smoke, and the smoke drifted over the Volga, where a frozen army waited for its fate. Inside the ruins, time no longer moved forward. It circled like smoke trapped in a glass jar. The Germans thought the city had already died after the first bombardments, yet somehow it kept breathing. Under the layers of ash and broken brick, soldiers and civilians carved tunnels through debris, hauling ammunition by hand, cooking thin soup over oil lamps and marking each sunrise not by light, but by the sound of artillery that never stopped. It was not a city anymore, it was a heartbeat made of iron and dust. Across the river, new soldiers arrived each night exhausted, shivering their faces, gray with smoke. They crossed the Volga in small boats under artillery fire, the black water splitting open under shells. Many never made it to shore. The ones who did crawled through mud and rubble until they found a wall, a shadow, a place to fight. They were teenagers, farmers, factory workers, miners sent here not to live, but to hold. Behind them were the NKVD units with orders to shoot any man who fled. In front of them was the endless roar of the Sixth Army. Between the two, they learned what it meant to be Soviet. The command post of General Vasily Chuikov, head of the 62nd Army, was buried inside a cliff above the Volga damp, freezing, vibrating with every explosion. From there, he directed the defense with a single principle: hug the enemy. Stay close, so close that the Germans could not call in their artillery or airstrikes without killing their own men. It was brutal, primitive, and effective. For every building taken, the Germans paid with rivers of blood. For every meter gained, they left behind the bodies of 10. Factories became fortresses. The Red October barricade and tractor plant were no longer industrial sites. They were war machines carved into the earth. Steel presses turned into barricades. Conveyor belts carried ammunition instead of tools. The workers who once built tanks now fought inside them, firing through holes cut in the factory walls. The air reeked of smoke oil and human sweat. Sparks flew from welding torches beside corpses not yet cold. Chuikov called it the furnace. His men called it home. Among them was Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, a name that would outlive the battle itself. His unit of just 24 men took shelter in a 4-story apartment building overlooking a square. For 58 days they held it against continuous German assaults. Mortar shells shredded the windows, tanks circled the streets below, but Pavlov's men fortified each floor with machine guns, mines, and bricks. At night, they crawled out to resupply through sewers. The Germans nicknamed it the House of the Damned. After the war, Zhukov would say, the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. Everywhere across the city, similar stories unfolded. A sniper named Vasily Zaitsev hunted the ruins like a ghost, his rifle wrapped in cloth to mute its sound. He killed over 200 enemies in less than 2 months, not for numbers, but for survival. In one of his duels, he faced a German sniper sent specifically to hunt him. The battle lasted days, silent, patient, cruel. They waited in ruins, breath frozen on their rifles. When it ended, the German lay motionless in the dust, and Zaitsev's legend spread through the trenches like fire in dry grass. He became a myth the living needed to believe in. Yet heroism could not hide the horror. Hunger was a shadow that never left. Soldiers boiled belts for soup, scraped frozen fat from machine parts, chewed grain meant for horses. Frostbite blackened fingers until rifles fused with flesh. Men slept beside corpses for warmth. In diaries later recovered, one soldier wrote, "We fight the Germans. We fight the cold. We fight the river. We fight ourselves." The battle had no front lines, only rooms, hallways, breaths. By late October, the German advance slowed to a crawl. Paulus's divisions were exhausted, their tanks bogged down in debris. Ammunition was running low, and morale had begun to fracture. The 6th Army reported losing 20,000 men per week. Even the Luftwaffe, once so dominant, struggled against Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The Red Army's supply boats still crossed the Volga, barely surviving the barrage, bringing in more defenders, more bullets, more hope. The balance had begun to shift, invisibly, slowly, but inevitably. For the people still trapped in the city, there was no distinction between soldier and civilian. Women carried rifles beside their sons. Children hauled water to the front. A nurse named Lyudmila served in the basements of the barricade factory, treating hundreds of wounded with only rags and melted snow. "We had no morphine," she recalled. "They screamed and we sang to drown the noise." Her hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Even as the walls collapsed around them, they kept working, not because anyone ordered them to, but because someone had to. By November, the frost set in like iron. The Volga froze along its banks. The Germans dug trenches in the rubble, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow. The Soviets, too, were barely human silhouettes moving through fog breath, glowing in the dim light of burning oil. Each side believed the other was on the verge of collapse. Each side was right. And yet in that mutual destruction, something shifted. The Soviet defenders had endured the unendurable. The Germans had reached the limit of conquest. Stalingrad had not fallen, it had transformed. It was no longer a city to capture. It was a myth being born. The defense of Stalingrad was not planned. It was instinct, pain, and defiance woven together. For more than 3 months, the 62nd Army and the civilians who remained turned ruins into trenches and despair into resistance. The city had become its own weapon, and every man, woman, and child inside it a part of that weapon. When the first snow fell, the outlines of the destroyed factories glowed faintly in the moonlight, like the skeleton of a beast that refused to die. And in the frozen silence that followed each bombardment, one could almost hear it, the pulse of a city that refused to stop beating. From the map above, the two systems of power appear distinct and unambiguous. On one side, Germany brings technology, discipline, and speed. On the other, the Soviet Union brings depth of manpower, mobile industry, and a will forged from the fear of losing home. When Case Blue unfolded, the Wehrmacht surged east with first-rate mechanized units, armored divisions, mobile artillery, and an air force that dominated the sky. But every tread, every gun, every tank needed fuel and ammunition, carried along supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Those lines began to crack as the advance lengthened. Stavka answered not with elegance of maneuver, but with mass, with industrial depth, and with what history would later call an infinite tolerance for loss. In raw numbers, the Soviets amassed an enormous force to prepare the counterstroke. More than 1 million men assembled for the operation, roughly 900 tanks concentrated at decisive points, and thousands upon thousands of artillery pieces poised to fire. The senior commanders Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and others designed a double envelopment, aimed precisely at the vulnerable flanks held by Romania, Hungary, and Italy, rather than at the Wehrmacht's hardened cores. The goal was not to slug it out inside the city, but to cut the army there off from the world. Operation Uranus began on 19th of November 1942 with one clear objective: do not bleed, to take the city, cut its lifelines, and trap the enemy within the ruins. On the ground, logistics became a matter of life and death. The trapped 6th Army required an enormous daily throughput of supplies. Commanders estimated that to sustain an encircled force of that size, one would need roughly 500 to 700 tons per day, a figure the air bridge could not hope to meet under winter skies and enemy fire. The Luftwaffe's promise of an aerial supply lifeline was undermined by exhausted crews, damaged airfields, fierce anti-aircraft defenses, and weather that turned the sky into a killing ground. At best, during the most favorable windows, deliveries reached several hundred tons for a few days, far short of what was needed. The paradox is stark. The technological superiority of air power and mechanized formations could not feed infantry buried in ice and rubble. Morale, that unmeasurable but decisive factor, tilted the balance. German confidence at first gave way to fatigue, hunger, and frost. The picture at home filled with anxious letters and the grinding realization that orders to hold at all costs had become death warrants rather than tactical guidance. On the Soviet side, morale was fanned by propaganda, by the terror of losing homeland, and by new myths born in the ruins: Pavlov's house snipers, who became legends, neighborhood defenses that refused to fall, stories that tied men to place and purpose. Where morale slipped, capability did too, and at Stalingrad, that slippage gradually favored the besiegers. The counter-strategy itself was both clinical and ruthless. Operation Uranus was conceived as a pincer timed and placed to exploit the weakest links rather than the strongest points. It targeted the flanks held by Axis satellite armies rather than the Wehrmacht's elite formations. The Soviets concentrated artillery and armor at two main thrusts: masked movements with deception and waited for terrain and weather to favor movement. The choice of late November was deliberate. Frozen ground would allow tanks to move across areas that would otherwise bog down in mud, and the dispersal of German forces across a vast front meant that striking where the enemy was thin could create sudden and decisive collapse. Tactically, the operation combined heavy preparatory barrages, rapid armored exploitation into the gaps, and immediate infantry seizure of lines of communication and junctions to prevent withdrawal and resupply. Maskirovka deception played a crucial role with feints, false concentrations, and camouflaged movements, keeping German commanders uncertain of the true point of weight. From 19 to 23 November, the northern and southern pincers shattered the fragile defenses of the Axis allies. By the time Soviet spearheads met near Kalach, the trap was shut. Somewhere between 250 and 300,000 Axis troops, including German and Allied units, found themselves enclosed in a pocket they could neither reinforce nor easily escape. Once encircled, logistics killed what tactics could not. Roads were cut, rail links severed, and the only hope became the airlift, a solution that proved unreliable and insufficient. The Sixth Army's demand for daily tonnage could not be met. The Luftwaffe's sporadic successes were not sustainable. In the frozen winter months, even shortfalls in fuel, spare parts, and medical supplies became fatal. Ammunition ran low, vehicles refused to start, disease spread, and the human body succumbed to the cold as surely as to enemy fire. Hitler's order to hold, coupled with his insistence on an aerial lifeline, turned a tactical dilemma into a strategic catastrophe. Operation Uranus was not a miracle. It was the result of analysis, concentration, and the willingness to accept short-term costs for strategic gain. It turned German technical advantages, mobility, and air power into liabilities by strangling the logistical tail those advantages required. When the jaws closed, the modern myth of the Wehrmacht as an invincible machine began unraveling in the snow. Stalingrad ceased to be simply a city to be taken. It became a mechanism for undoing an overextended army, a place where attrition, and encirclement combined to produce a result far greater than the sum of its parts. The immediate consequence was catastrophic for the trapped forces, hundreds of thousands of men confined within a shrinking pocket, cut off from the material that sustains an army. Morale withered, sickness and starvation spread, and the political decision to forbid withdrawal turned an operational setback into a historic collapse. The fall of the Sixth Army would not be recorded as a single dramatic charge, but as a slow, grinding defeat that began with a strategic miscalculation and ended when logistics finally failed, when the sky would not deliver enough, and when the cold and the city itself did what the opposing armies could not. This is the hard lesson Stalingrad wrote into military history. Wars are decided not only by tanks and planes, but by supply timing, deception, and the capacity to turn the enemy's advantages into weaknesses. Operation Uranus did that with merciless efficiency, and when the ring tightened, the technical brilliance of a fighting force could no longer offset the simple arithmetic of starvation and isolation. The city of Stalingrad sprawled across the Volga like a wounded giant, its streets shattered by artillery, its factories gutted and rubble piled into impossible mounds where soldiers and civilians alike fought for every inch of frozen ground. From August 1942, the German Sixth Army advanced with the arrogance of a force used to easy victories, confident that a few weeks would bring the city to its knees, yet they found resistance unlike any they had known. The Red Army, reinforced by local militia workers and hastily conscripted civilians, clung to every street, every basement, every crumbling building, converting ruins into barricades and alleys into killing zones. The Luftwaffe had already turned the skyline into smoldering skeletons, yet from the ash emerged defenders' rifles in hand, ready to die for meters of territory. Each factory, every apartment block, Every corner of the city became a front line where survival was earned in blood frost and unyielding tenacity. In September, German troops entered expecting open avenues, believing the city would yield like so many others across Eastern Europe. Yet what met them were labyrinthine streets, collapsed buildings, and barricaded factories. Pavlov's house, the Red October factory, the Barricadi plant, each a miniature fortress holding hundreds of Soviet soldiers for weeks at a time. Corridors became hunting grounds, stairwells ambushes, basements sniper nests, open squares transformed into slaughter fields under machine gun fire and relentless mortar barrages. Tanks were trapped artillery rendered almost useless by debris and ruined roads, and coordination among units broke down under the constant close-quarters chaos. Infantry fought at arm's length, throwing grenades into rooms, wielding bayonets, sometimes fighting barehanded. The battle had shrunk from kilometers to meters, transforming the urban environment into a deadly chessboard. By October, both sides were exhausted. German troops, ill-prepared for the Siberian cold, shivered in winter uniforms, fingers frostbitten, while clutching rifles, stomachs gnawed by hunger. Supplies trapped in convoys, stranded by mud and snow. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga at night, under artillery fire carrying ammunition water, and men to the front lines melting snow to drink, scavenging what little remained. Every ruin became a tool for defense. Every collapsed building a fortress, every street a gauntlet. Attrition consumed elite soldiers and raw recruits alike, and even officers whispered about the impossibility of holding positions haunted by the knowledge that death was as near as the next corner. In November, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a carefully planned counteroffensive designed not to storm the city directly, but to encircle the overextended German forces. The flanks held by Romanian and Hungarian units proved catastrophically weak, and within days, Soviet artillery and armored thrusts from north and south pinched the Sixth Army into a vice. Rail and road lines were cut. Supply depots were captured or destroyed, and the Luftwaffe's promised air bridge could only deliver a fraction of the daily tonnage required to sustain the trapped troops. Within 3 days, nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers isolated in freezing rubble faced hunger disease and the unrelenting pressure of a patient enemy. The trap had snapped shut, and the city itself had become a cage from which escape was impossible. Inside Stalingrad, fighting intensified street by street, building by building, floor by floor. Snipers stalked chimneys, machine gunners ambushed stairwells, small squads infiltrated basements to cut off German pockets. Civilians participated as well, moving supplies, guiding troops, barricading streets. Fires consumed blocks, snow mixed with blood, and the smell of smoke, burning oil, and decay thickened the air. Every building captured by German forces was often lost within hours, every advance costing hundreds of lives. Soldiers learned to move in rhythm with breath and timing, calculating distance between themselves and death. Accounts from the time describe corridors littered with bodies, communication broken officers, improvising tactics in darkness and smoke. December brought bitter frost. The Volga froze solid stranding barges and cutting off last-minute resupply efforts. German forces ran out of food, fuel, and medicine. Engines seized, rifles jammed with ice, soldiers died in trenches and among rubble. Letters home carried despair and resignation. Disease and frostbite claimed countless limbs, morale collapsed under constant shelling, artillery barrages, and the certainty that relief would not arrive. Even General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, reported daily shortages with growing desperation as the Red Army tightened the encirclement, exploiting every weakness, every gap, every frozen path. January 1943 saw the final days of resistance. The encircled Sixth Army could neither advance nor retreat. Attempts at breakout failed repeatedly, as Soviet artillery and infantry controlled every junction crossing and escape route. Supplies had vanished. Ammunition was depleted. Men were starving and frozen. Surrender became inevitable. On February 2nd, 1943, General Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal in a symbolic gesture from Hitler, capitulated along with roughly 91,000 survivors, most wounded, frostbitten, and emaciated. Tens of thousands had perished in combat starvation or exposure. The myth of German invincibility, cultivated over years of rapid victories, lay shattered on the snow-covered streets and rubble of Stalingrad. Stalingrad had transformed from a city into a crucible, a grinding furnace of urban warfare, attrition, starvation, and frost. Every meter of advance exacted a terrible price, and strategy was measured in survival, not glory. The Red Army had endured, adapted, and executed a counteroffensive that converted technologically superior mechanized forces into prisoners. Casualties were staggering: over 1.1 million Soviet dead, wounded, or missing, and approximately 850,000 Axis casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. The battle reshaped the Eastern Front, handed the Soviets strategic initiative, and marked one of the most decisive turning points in World War II. Even today, the streets, monuments, and surviving ruins of Volgograd echo the months of relentless combat: buildings, hollowed streets, scarred factories, gutted, bearing silent testimony to human endurance, ingenuity, and the cost of hubris. The city itself had become both a weapon and a grave, a stage on which courage collided with despair, strategy with chaos, and survival was measured in meters, days, and the human spirit. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was a paradigm shift in warfare, a lesson etched in snow, steel, and blood, forever memorialized in history, literature, and the memories of those who survived its inferno. Stalingrad, once a bustling city on the banks of the Volga, had been transformed into something else entirely, a monument of fire, ice, and human will, where every street, every building, every ruin told a story of endurance and despair. The echoes of artillery and machine guns had faded, but the memory of sweat, blood, and frost lingered in the walls, in the river, in the silence that followed. It was a city that had swallowed an army yet survived to tell the tale, a place where survival was forged not only in strategy and weaponry, but in the sheer unyielding spirit of those who refused to yield. The soldiers who emerged from the ruins carried scars beyond the physical memories of comrades: the unbearable cold, the screams in stairwells and basements, and the relentless grinding of attrition. The civilians, too, bore witness to a war that had invaded every home, every workshop, every market square. Stalingrad had become a crucible of humanity, testing courage, loyalty, fear, and the resolve of ordinary people forced to perform extraordinary feats. The city itself had been both weapon and grave, shaping the course of the Eastern Front in ways no map or general's plan could fully capture. History remembers numbers: over 1 million casualties, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, cities destroyed, industries crippled. Yet those figures can never fully convey the rhythm of life and death within the ruins, the microcosm of struggle on every corner, in every cellar, in every ruined apartment. Each man, each woman, each child had played a role in a symphony of chaos that became legend. And yet, amid the horror, amid the frost and fire, human ingenuity and courage persisted. Improvisation, strategy, and endurance turned the tide, proving that no matter the weapon, the heart of a people could alter the course of war. From the ashes, a lesson resounded. Warfare is not merely measured in tanks, planes, or artillery, but in the coordination of minds, the endurance of bodies, and the unyielding will to resist. The triumph at Stalingrad became a turning point, a signal that the Wehrmacht could be stopped, that empires could falter, and that determination, patience, and strategy could shape history in the face of superior technology. Its shadow would stretch across the Eastern Front, influencing every maneuver, every siege, every decision that followed. And yet the city remained alive, silent, yet speaking to those who walked its streets decades later. Its ruins teaching the same lessons, whispering about courage, hubris, sacrifice, and survival. Flags were raised, monuments erected, museums built, but the truest memorial lay in memory, in story, in the enduring pulse of human experience that refused to be erased. Stalingrad was a testament not just to the horrors of war, but to the resilience and ingenuity of those caught within it, and a reminder that even in devastation there is meaning and consequence. As we leave the ruins of Stalingrad behind, in our minds, let us remember that the echoes of courage, strategy, and endurance carry forward into every battlefield, every struggle, and every story that history tells. Some lessons were written in fire and steel, others in frost and silence. And the next story begins where the last echo faded, carrying the weight of memory, the pulse of human will, and the knowledge that even in ruins, history speaks.